Hello, everyone. You all ready for 4th of July? Got any big plans? Stay off the road. I was reading the other day that when it comes to the fireworks, the tradition of fireworks, depending on whether or not you like that, I like it, but at the same time, I can imagine that others might not, with all the booming sounds happening from 9 o'clock till 3 a.m. So I can imagine that some don't. But I read the other day that if you're wanting to know where the idea of fireworks on the 4th of July came from, John Adams, our second president. Can you hear me? Oh, we don't have a mic for the speakers. All right, can you all hear me now? Can you all hear me? You, right here, right here. I have never understood the whole when people come in, they just want to sit in the back. I just don't understand that. I saw this cartoon online the other day, and it had a preacher, and he was he was right in front of the very back row, and you had 100 people stacked up like cordwood on the back row, and he was just saying, you can come up front. It's okay. We got other pews up here. So I just never understood that. But anyway, I'll speak up. We are continuing our study of women of the Bible. Tonight we are talking about Tamar. 4th of July? I'm pretty sure they will. Okay, I did not know that. Now I know that our next door neighbors, they decorate their house for every holiday. I'm surprised they don't have something for Arbor Day with trees. They have like their Halloween, Christmas, Thanksgiving, 4th of July. 4th of July, they're from New York, and I think he knows someone from New York that gets him a lot of fireworks that are really cheap. They put on a really, really good show in the cul-de-sac. I do remember about 2 years ago, though, Beth and I just walked up to the top of the hill and we were watching them, and they accidentally, instead of one of theirs going up, it went this way, and went right past Beth's head. So we tend to be a little cautious with that. But thanks for the information. But we are talking about Tamar tonight, women of the Bible, Tamar. This is a lady in the Bible that probably some of you might not have heard of. She is not really talked about in regular Sunday school, and there's a reason for that, as we're going to see tonight, because this topic, or talking about what goes on in Genesis chapter 38 with her life, this is it's appropriate for an adult class. It's not really something that is appropriate for anyone below the age of teenager, I would say. And even with teenagers, the subject matter would need to be handled tactfully. That's what I'm planning on doing tonight. But there is a lot that we can learn from her. You read about her in Genesis chapter 38. Now, usually when you're going through Genesis, starting with chapter 37, that's when you get into the life of Joseph. Joseph, you read about his birth a few chapters earlier, but it's in chapter 37 that you begin to see what is normally taught about Joseph in Sunday school, that he was Jacob's favorite. The episode with the coat of many colors, the episode with the dreams where God gives him miraculous prophetic dreams. He shares them with his family. He earns his brother's scorn. And then when Jacob sends him on an errand to go off to where his brothers were in another part of the land, his brothers see him coming. They plot to kill him. But Judah, one of the older brothers, Judah persuades them instead to sell him into slavery. I think that Reuben was initially persuaded them not to kill him, but Reuben was going to set him free. But Judah came along while Reuben was away, and they saw some Ishmaelite gypsy traders off there in the distance, and they said, hey, let's just go ahead and get him out of our hair forever, and we'll sell him into slavery, and that's what they do. And then they tell Jacob, they dip Joseph's coat of colors in animal's blood, and they present it to Jacob, and they say a wild animal must have killed Joseph. And he goes off to Egypt. Now, that's Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 39, you read about him in Egypt with Potiphar's wife, and then going on as with the rest of his life, as we are very familiar with. But chapter 38 is just kind of inserted right in the middle there, and it's this episode in the life of one of his brothers, Judah, and how Judah comes across a woman named Tamar and what happens with them. There are some very interesting things that take place here, and there's some applicable lessons that we can learn, several of them. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to go through the entire chapter of 38 and read about Judah and Tamar. So I'm going to go ahead and start off, read the first 5 verses of Genesis chapter 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. Now, we are not given the reason why Judah decided to leave his family and just go off down to where the Canaanites were. If I was to harbor a guess, I would say that Judah is not presented in a very good light up to this point, because after all, he was in the previous chapter. He was one of the brothers that had determined that it was okay to kill their younger brother whom they hated. And then it was his particular idea that determined that, hey, we can just sell our brother into slavery. Earlier, he was among him and the other brothers under the leadership of Simeon and Levi to avenge their sister's honor when she was raped. They slaughtered all the men in an entire village. You can read about that earlier in Genesis. So Judah, at this point in his life, there's not that much indication that he is a very godly individual. And you kind of see that here. He leaves his family, and instead of trying to find a wife from his father or his mother's family like Jacob had done and Isaac had done before him, he goes off and he goes to the Canaanites. One of the reasons why in the Old Testament, about 400 years after Judah lived, when the law of Moses was given to Judah's descendants in Israel, one of the reasons why God had specified that they were not to intermarry with non-Jewish nations, such as the Canaanites, is because the nations around them were extremely immoral, extremely sinful, extremely idolatrous. And God wanted Israel to basically be set apart and to be kept morally and spiritually pure, because he had already decided that it would be through Israel that the Messiah would come, Jesus. In fact, he had already determined that it would be through Judah, actually, that through specifically Judah's heritage, that Jesus would come. But here you have Judah, and he's going off and he's marrying a Canaanite, pagan woman. And that has the potential to put God's plans into jeopardy here. And so one of the things that we will see here in chapter 38 is how God's providence can work in very mysterious ways, that God can actually take, as we will see, sinful actions that are committed by people, and yet still use them to ultimately fulfill his long-term divine plan. We've already seen that with Rachel and Leah, and we will see that also with, we saw that with Hagar and Sarah, and we will see that tonight with Tamar as well. Another possibility about why he left is he's presented as a kind of a pretty hard-nosed evil person. I mean, he sells his brother into slavery. But at the same time, people do have consciences. And I can imagine that it would be it might have been at least, pretty difficult for Judah. He sees his father mourning in severe grief for Joseph every single day. He knows he has a secret. I'm responsible for that. That was my idea. My father is grieving because of something that I did, because of an idea that I had. My other brothers are to blame too, but I have a special sort of blame for this. Maybe he just wanted to get away from it. He didn't want his conscience to bother him anymore. He wanted to get away from seeing his father grieving day in and day out, so he leaves. He marries a Canaanite. We know that he married her because it's mentioned. It's mentioned that in verse 12 that she was his wife, and she bears him 3 sons. He names the first one She names the next 2, Onan and Shelah. So that's where we are through verse 5. Now let's keep reading. We'll go through from verse 6 to verse 11. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went in to his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up." For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. Now there are a lot of things to talk about in this section. This is where Tamar enters the picture. It's implied that she is a Canaanite as well, just from the context here, because that's the area that Judah is raising his boys in. So at this time, he's probably in his teens or early 20s. And so Judah, they had arranged marriages back then. And so Judah takes a wife for and that would be Tamar. Now in verse 7, we see that who is Judah's firstborn, says that God considered him wicked, and so God put him to death. Now we don't know anything more than that. We don't know exactly what did that was sinful. We don't know to the degree of sinfulness. We do know that God has the right because he is our creator and we are the created. He is the potter. We are the clay. The clay here being is not, just by virtue of sinning, is not living up to the potter's or the creator's purpose here. A similar episode would be in the New Testament with Ananias and Sapphira, where God killed them for lying to the Holy Spirit and to the apostles as well. But we don't know exactly what did, but God considered him to be wicked, and he killed him. Now, it's very hard to basically marry his older brother's widow and basically when it says perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. It's basically, that's what scholars call a levirate, I believe it's pronounced, levirate marriage. It's actually commanded in the Old Testament, the law of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 25. And it's hard for us to understand that today. One of the reasons why it's hard for us to understand it today is because our culture, westernized culture, has been very heavily influenced by New Testament Christianity. And New Testament Christianity, believe it or not, when you study it very carefully, New Testament Christianity promoted a lot of principles that would give women in general a lot more rights. In ancient times such as this, a woman was completely she would have no means to provide for herself in any way, shape, or form. In most of these cultures back in ancient times, women were considered to be second-class or even third-class citizens, not able to hold a job or to have their own property or anything like that. And so a woman who is married, but then she's not had any children yet, and her husband dies, and so she is a childless widow. She's in some pretty bad trouble. So how's she going to take care of herself? Who's going to provide for her? Who's going to put food on her table? And so a lot of ancient cultures came up with this idea of levirate marriages, which is basically that if you are married to a woman and you pass away before, and she is childless, or she has extremely young children that are incapable of providing for her yet, they've not reached adulthood, then your family would be considered responsible to continue to provide for her. And specifically, if you had a brother, then custom demanded in that culture that, and this is in many pagan cultures of that time period, that your brother would basically make your widow his wife and have a child by her, and that the first child that they had, he would be considered to be your heir, even though you had passed on. So, and then any future children that you had, that would be considered to be your brother's heir. This was a customary way to basically provide for widows who were childless and whose husbands had died. And so that's basically what Judah is doing here. Now look at verse 9. It says that Onan, the second born, he knows that the offspring would not be his. So he knows that when he marries Tamar, which apparently he did, but that when he is basically being intimate with her and getting her pregnant, that first child that they would have, even though it would be his biologically, it would be considered to be his dead brother's by everyone else when it came to inheritance. So some of his own wealth, some of his own money that he would be putting aside for his own children, now he realizes that's not actually going to go to a child that's considered to be mine. It's going to go to a child that is considered to be my brother's. And he doesn't want that to happen. There's an implication here of selfishness on his part, a lack of consideration for Tamar, because again, she is totally dependent on him providing her with a child so that that future income can provide for her in her old age. He knows that, but apparently he doesn't care about that. And so what does he do? He doesn't completely deny her conjugal rights here, but he apparently knows that he will not be able, he doesn't want to impregnate her, so as verse 9 says, as some of your translations say, that whenever he goes into his brother's wife, he would waste the seed on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. Put yourself in Tamar's shoes. You're in that situation. You're in a very intimate situation with a husband that you are getting the impression is only your husband out of a sense of familial obligation rather than love. You're in that very intimate situation with him, and then he goes out of his way right in the middle of the act to purposefully keep you from getting pregnant, which a woman, both biologically today, but especially back then in that society, that was a woman's top priority, to bear and nurture children. She's being denied that purposefully by her husband. Oh, if you were in her shoes, would there be humiliation? Would there be resentment? Would there be bitterness? Yeah, there would be. Now, there's a reason, keeping all that in mind, therefore, you look at verse 10, where it says, and what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death also. Now we have an understanding why God reacted like that. Because Onan is acting out of complete selfishness, possibly greed, lack of consideration for the woman that is his responsibility to care for. He is humiliating her. He is causing resentment to her. And so God punishes him for it. Now in verse 11, after his death, Judah says to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up. Now, apparently Shelah is not yet old enough to be married. So that's implying here that Shelah's probably this little kid at this point. But you also see what's implied here, that Judah does not really mean what he's saying here. He's promising his youngest son to Tamar, just like he had promised Onan to Tamar. My youngest boy, just wait 5 years, 10 years, once he goes through puberty, and then he will marry you. But it's implied here that Judah does not merely mean it, because it says that Judah feared that Shelah, his third son, would die like his brothers. Maybe Judah thought that Tamar was jinxed, bad luck for some reason. There's no implication here that Judah was told by God that God had killed his two other sons. So perhaps Judah thinks that Tamar is bad luck. It's implied here that he's not really going to allow his youngest son to marry her, and the rest of the text will show that too. So verse 11, Tamar goes and remains in her father's house. Now, verse 12, we will read verses 12 through 14. In course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and wrapped herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Anaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. So some time has passed. Verse 12 says in course of time. Now, that could be 5 years, 10 years, however long it took for Shelah to grow up. But by this time, Tamar knows that promise that Judah had made to her about his youngest, he's not going to go through with that. She is in a very, very stressful, bad situation for a woman. She is staying at her father's house. Her father is therefore providing for her. But her father is going to die someday. And under the customs of that time, none of his wealth, none of his inheritance would go to her. If he had brothers, or if she had brothers, and he had sons, it would go to them. She has already been married. Culturally, she is her husband's responsibility for financial protection and care, not her father's. She knows this. So she's seeing her father grow older and older. She knows that he's going to die one day. She knows that she will get nothing. She knows that she will be destitute. What am I to do? She looks over, she watches Shelah grow up. He's past age 7, age 8, age 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Judah's not coming to her. Judah's not saying, okay, You will now be his wife. She sees the writing on the wall. She knows that her father-in-law has lied to her. She knows that if she does not do something, that she's going to be in trouble. So here's what her plan is. She sees that Judah's wife has died. And Judah, by this point, his two older sons are dead. His youngest son has not yet married. Supposed to marry her. Hasn't happened yet. So her plan now is I am going to get him. I'm going to get my father-in-law to impregnate me and have offspring by him. He lied to me. I'm going to trick him in return, and I'm going to force him to provide for me. So what she does, she hears that his wife has died, and when it says in verse 12, when he was comforted, so apparently when the appropriate time of mourning and grieving was over, he goes up to Timnah to his sheep shearers. Now, if you read the rest of the Old Testament, one of the things that you will see implied is that when shepherds, when it came time in the year, during the time of year when you would shear your sheep, it was a big festival. It was a big party, a big event. Like, for example, later on in this series of lessons of women on the Bible, we're going to read about a woman named Abigail. Abigail lived during the life of David. One of the things we will see when we study her life is that her husband was shearing his sheep. There was a huge party, a big festival. Her husband got extremely drunk. It's kind of like sheep shearing in that time is comparable to Mardi Gras today. When you think of Mardi Gras, what do you think of? Lots of partying, but what's happening at that party? Lots of fornication, lots of drinking. People are getting drunk. That's what's happening. She knows that Judah is going up there. He's going to be taking part in the festivities. Again, at this point in his life, Judah is not in any way showing himself to be a godly person in any way, shape, or form. So he's going up there. He's getting involved in the festivities. Tamar's thinking, I'm going to have him right where I want him. When he's on his way back, very good chance he's going to be drunk out of his mind. And being drunk out of his mind, being involved in all of the revelries that's going up there, probably being surrounded by prostitutes, maybe he had the reputation, as we will see, of being involved with prostitutes. Maybe she knows that. Now, I will present myself. I will meet him on the way. I will present myself. I will cover my face with a veil so he doesn't know who I am, but I will dress like a prostitute and seduce him, and then I will trap him because he will be the one that will provide me the offspring. So, as we see in verse 14, she has been in mourning all this time. She's taking off her widow's garments. In today's culture, it would be wearing black. We don't know exactly what it meant back then. But she takes off her widow's garments. She covers herself with a veil. She wraps herself up. And wrapping herself up, it's implied here that she wraps herself up in such a way with clothes that would advertise to the passerby that she is selling her body, that she is basically a prostitute. She sits down on the road to Timnah, and she waits for Judah to pass by. So let's keep reading, verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought that she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. So he probably thinks she's a prostitute by what she's wearing. He doesn't recognize her face because she's covered it with the veil. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. So her plan works, and she's trapped him because she basically says, I'm a prostitute, so what are you going to give me? And he says, I'll give you a goat. Animals were currency back then. She says, well, what collateral will you offer me? So because, if I don't have any collateral from you, you'll just get up and you're not going to give me that goat. He says, okay, I'm going to give you collateral. And he says, if you look at verse 18, she asked for his signet and his cord and his staff, which are basically items of clothing, and also the staff. Basically, it's things that everyone would know belonged to him, and things that were very valuable to him. And so they make that agreement. She seduces him. He is intimate with her. She conceives by him. And then verse 19, her plan has come to fruition. And it's pretty clear that she doesn't want to be thought by anyone other than him to be a prostitute, because she immediately changes clothes, goes away, and puts her widow's garments back on. Verse 20. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. This would be his friend the Adullamite who did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim at the roadside? And they said, no cult prostitute has been here. One thing I found very interesting when I was doing my research on this is that if you go up to verse 15, and where it says that Judah saw her and he thought that she was a prostitute, the word for prostitute is a completely different word in the Hebrew from down here in verse 21, where my translation calls it a cult prostitute. That's a different Hebrew word, and the reason why it's translated here, cult prostitute, is because that particular Hebrew word is describing a particular type of prostitute, a religious prostitute. So apparently his friend, he considers Tamar, Judah considers Tamar, just to be a regular street-walking prostitute. But when his friend doesn't find her to pay her the goat, his friend starts asking around, but it says to me here that maybe his friend wants to put Judah in a little bit better light. And so instead of saying, well, I'm just looking for the regular type of prostitute that was here by the road, he's like, oh, I'm looking for the religious prostitute. You see, this is something that if he's wanting people to think that he himself is wanting to pay her, or if he's a representative of Judah, he's wanting people to get the impression. This is something that this transaction is just for religious purposes. He's trying to put either himself or his friend Judah in the best possible light here. And so he uses the different terminology here. But they say, hey, no cult prostitute has been here. Verse 22. So he returned to Judah and said, I have not found her. Also the men of the place said, no cult prostitute has been here. And Judah replied, let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her. So Judah's wanting to go through his end of the deal. He had promised her a goat. He has given her the collateral of the signet and the cord and the staff, which apparently are very clearly, everyone knows that those belong to him. And he can't find her. And so basically he says to his friend, look, don't pursue it further, because my reputation is at risk here. Let her just go ahead and keep the collateral I've given her, because if this gets out, then everyone will mock me. I tried to pay her with the goat like I promised, can't find her, so we'll just consider the matter closed. And now she springs the trap. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. Notice this next part here. And Judah said, bring her out, let her be burned. One of the things that really stands out to me is it's a very prevalent part of human nature. You see someone else's sin, and you really think that that's terrible, and you focus on it, and you are completely willing to dish out whatever punishment that sin is worthy of. But if you yourself are guilty of sin, specifically, if you yourself are guilty of the exact same sin, it's human nature to kind of just want to ignore that. Does any other more well-known Bible character do something very similar here? Anyone come to mind? David, who we don't know if he forced Bathsheba. He could have, being the king. But regardless, he commits adultery. He with the wife of one of his closest friends who had fought with him to keep Saul from killing him. He then lies to that friend, tries to fool that friend into thinking that his child is his friend's instead. And when that doesn't work, he murders his friend. Thinks he's gotten away with it. Judas thinks he's gotten away with it. And then he is told this nice little story by the prophet. There's a rich man, and he has everything in the world pretty much. His next door neighbor is this poor man who only has one possession, this little lamb that the poor man loves. And the rich man throws a party, and instead of going to his abundance to serve his guests the party, he decides to take his poor next door neighbor's one possession that he loves very much, his lamb, and kill the lamb and serve that to the guests. David, what do you think about that? That is a terrible, evil individual. That man deserves to die. So easy for us, generally speaking, to see the faults of others while ignoring our own, perhaps especially when our own fall under the same genre of sin. And that's what we see Judah here. Your daughter-in-law has been immoral. She's now pregnant by immorality. Then she deserves death. Never mind that he is involved in immorality as well. But here's where she traps him. Verse 25. As she was being brought out, apparently to be burned to death, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." So this is one of the Bible's gotcha moments. Look, if you do this to me, then everyone is going to know that the woman that you are killing for immorality is the same woman that you were being immoral with, that you are just as guilty, and that it happens to be your daughter-in-law, your twice widowed daughter-in-law, whom you had promised your third son, who is now old enough to marry me, but you're not keeping your end of the bargain. I will ruin your reputation if you do this. And he knows it. Look at verse 26. Then Judah identified them. He recognized, hey, I know who she is now. This is the collateral. She was the woman that I was with. And he said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. So Judah actually, he steps up here. There is an indication here of repentance. He acknowledges that he had done wrong. And he acknowledges her wrongdoing. He's already done that. But he also acknowledges, hey, if we both have done wrong here, I've done the worst wrong. Because I had promised my youngest son to her, and I wasn't willing to go through with it. And so he, as we will continue to read, he goes and takes responsibility for her when it comes to providing for her via the inheritance. Because verse 27 brings out that that she's going to have twins that belong to him, that he is the biological father to. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb, and when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. The fact that verse 26 says that Judah did not know her again, that implies that he felt some shame, and even though he apparently has taken her as his wife, he was not going to be intimate with her anymore out of shame. And he continues to provide for her children. You will read of her two boys, Perez and Zerah, later on in Genesis, because Judah will eventually, as you know, with the story of Joseph. Years later, when Joseph is second in most powerful person in Egypt, and the famine is going on, Judah and the rest of his brothers go to Egypt to buy grain. Joseph fools them, tricks them, lies to them several times, but finally he reveals himself to Judah and invites all of their families to come and stay with him under his protection in Egypt. And when you, I think it's in chapter 48, either chapter 47 or 48, when you read of Jacob's family that was traveling to Egypt to be reunited with Joseph and to move there and live there, you will read of these two boys of Judah. So that lets us know that Judah did take them and provide for them, and thus provided for Tamar as well. One thing that you can say for Judah, because we're not going to come back to him in this series on women of the Bible, but one thing you can say for Judah, the fact that in verse 26 that he says, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah," he's acknowledging his wrongdoing here, and you see a hint of humility here. This could be the turning point in his life, because if you keep reading, when he does, years later, make it to Egypt, and Joseph has not revealed himself to them yet. You remember Joseph imprisoned Simeon until they could prove that Benjamin was alive. They could bring Benjamin. And then when they brought Benjamin, you remember Joseph played that trick on them by taking his special cup and hiding it in Benjamin's sack. And then when he arrested all of them, of course, Judah and the other brothers don't know. And so they say, "Hey, whichever one of us in his sack, if you find that cup, then he can be your slave." They're very confident that nothing's going to happen. And then when the cup is found in Benjamin's sack, Judah realizes Benjamin is our father's favorite, since he thinks Joseph is dead. And so he's the son that Rachel died giving birth to, and Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. And if we come back without Benjamin, after what we did to Joseph, it's going to kill our father. Judah realizes that, and you can, later on in Genesis, Judah gives this very, very righteous speech to Joseph, in which he basically says, "Hey, if you're going to enslave someone, take me. Take me." He is offering his own life to Joseph to save his brother and also to save his father from a grief that would kill him. That speaks very well of Judah. It shows that Judah, by that time, that Judah, at least in some areas of his life, was a changed man. This right here in verse 26, when he acknowledges his wrongdoing with Tamar, that could have been the first step towards that, because everything else that you see from Judah up to this point, Judah is portrayed as a very, very wicked, evil man. But by the end of his life, he is portrayed as a penitent man. In fact, Jacob, when Jacob is dying in Genesis chapter 49, and he is giving these prophetic blessings to each one of his sons. With Simeon and Levi, he pronounces curses on them because they killed that entire village. With Reuben, Reuben had been intimate with one of his father's concubines. He pronounces a curse upon Reuben as well. But Judah, on the other hand, Judah, he actually prophetically prophesies that the Messiah would come from Judah's descendants. That implies that as far as Jacob was concerned, Judah had been increasing in righteousness in these previous years. I found that very interesting. I'm going to close this out by bringing out a couple of modern day lessons for this. Go over to the New Testament real quick. Book of Matthew, chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1, this is where the famous begats chapter, the genealogy of Jesus. Look at verses 2 and 3. Matthew chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac the father of Tamar. God brought Judah. Do you remember who Judah's mother was? Judah's mother was Leah. Was Jacob supposed to be married to Leah? No, the deal was with Laban, he would work 7 years for Rachel. Laban, and possibly Leah too, tricked him into marrying Leah. Judah was the result of that, and God was still able to take that and use it to accomplish his long-term plan. Perez and Zerah are the result of a sinful union between Judah and his daughter-in-law, but Judah thought he was with a prostitute. Fornication. And yet, God was still able to use that to accomplish his long-term plan as well. That's one lesson that I get from this. It teaches us that God's providence is powerful and it's mysterious as well. Another lesson I get from this is, do you think that Judah, when he decided that he was going to basically commit fornication with this prostitute that he meets on the side of the road, do you think that he thought that anyone would find out? Do you think that it would have ever crossed his mind that basically the entire world for the rest of the world's existence would know what he did? Because after all, it's recorded in the Bible. For all of us, thousands of years later, we're talking about it. Do you think that ever crossed his mind? There's a passage in Numbers where Moses said, "Be sure your sin will find you out." And this is a great example of that happening. Be sure your sin will find you out. Here's the thing. With some of us, it may be that with what we do, that we may be able to completely hide it from everyone here in this world. For all of our life, no one will ever know. But who does know? God does know. And if we don't repent of that sin, then the Bible brings out that it will be brought up at judgment. That God will reveal every secret thing, whether good or evil. Ecclesiastes 20. Why? Well, what do prostitutes normally do that would attract customers? More specifically, what do they wear? What do they wear? They wear very immodest clothing. That's what they do in this culture today. That's what they always do in this culture today. One of the things that I, even now, am teaching my girls, even at their age, but one of the things that we must teach young women and men as well. What you choose to wear matters. It matters. Do you want, and I know we have some parents with kids that are grown here, but for those of you who are parents that the kids are still under your roof, and you have little boys, do you want when they get older, do you want women, girls, to basically be lusting after them and be trying to seduce them so that they commit fornication with them? Do you want that to happen, yes or no? Teach them to dress modestly. Even more so, if you have women, girls, do you want the guys that they are surrounded with at school, do you want them to view your daughter as a sex object, as basically just a piece of meat? Do you want that? Here's the thing. Teach them to dress modestly. You're the parent. Demand it. Demand it. Make it so. As a young man, well, I'm 43. I'm still young. But you know what? I remember being a teenage boy. I remember it. Some women don't really get it because you're not men. You guys, just like you guys say about us men, you don't understand pregnancy because you're not a woman. Well, all right. You don't understand male hormones because you're not a man. You're not a young teenage boy. Let me tell you, it's all that boys think about. It really is. It really is. And when you see, when a young boy, I don't care if he's in the church or not, he sees a girl that's dressed immodestly, the cleavage is showing, the midriff is showing, the thighs are showing, the rear end is accentuated, he is thinking about one thing for a very long time. Do you want your daughter to be thought of in that way? No, I don't. So teach them the value of modesty. Tamar knew exactly what she was doing. She knew exactly how to trap her daughter-in-law or her father-in-law. And how she chose to dress was a big part of it. And guess what? It worked. It worked. Any thoughts or questions or comments on this before we conclude? We are not going to have this series for the next 2 weeks because next week I am scheduled to speak at the Adairsville congregation, and then the following week I am scheduled to speak at a congregation in Greenville, South Carolina, for both times for their Wednesday night summer series that they're putting on. So I'm not going to be here for the next 2 Wednesdays, but Lord willing, in 3 weeks we will pick up this series on Women on the Bible again. So thank you all for your attention and your comments. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, I pray that you will help us to take what we've learned tonight from studying the episode in your word with Judah and Tamar, and that we can learn the lessons that you want us to learn, that you had in mind for including this in your scriptures. We pray, Father, that we can teach it to others, especially our children and our grandchildren. Watch over us now. Thank you for the ice cream that is being prepared for by our young people in the next room. Help us to enjoy each other's company and fellowship tonight. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.